Do you know there are more people in slavery today than at any other time in human history? And instead of sitting here and talking about the Christian God, you can actually do something to end it.
This is a fallacy known as a whataboutism. This is when someone attacks their opponent rather than the argument. Anita has no way of knowing if those who critique biblical slavery also work against modern slavery. But even if we don't, it has no bearing whatsoever on whether our critiques against the Bible are accurate.
You assume that you are morally superior to the Christian God, which is ironic because you're an atheist. Your worldview has no moral compass. You don't have a moral ground to stand on to accuse God.
This is yet another fallacious argument based on a completely false pretense. For one, there is no uniform atheistic worldview. Atheism is only the lack of belief in any gods. It alone makes no moral claims, but that doesn't mean atheists have no morals. But once again, even if we didn't, it would have no bearing on whether or not the Bible endorsed slavery.
Now, something to understand about the Leviticus passages and passages like it is that biblical slavery is completely different from oppressive slavery, what we saw in the transatlantic slave trade.
Is the transatlantic slave trade the only oppressive form of slavery? What does Anita consider oppressive? By its very definition, enslaved people did not have their freedom. Is a complete lack of freedom not oppressive on its own? Is it oppressive for your children to be born slaves for life? Is being vulnerable to physical violence oppressive? Is being vulnerable to sexual violence oppressive? If none of this is considered oppressive, I don't know what could be.
Many times, slaves were captives taken from war. They would have otherwise been killed if they were not taken as slaves or servants.
And? Is Anita seriously implying that because the only alternative to slavery for Israel's enemies is death, that slavery is therefore justified? And please take note that this is not just a cultural norm. The Bible endorsed these rules of engagement in Deuteronomy 20 verses 10 through 17. What's particularly disturbing is that a similar argument was made by slavery apologists in the American South, like George Fitzhugh. He argued in his published debate with an abolitionist that Africans were far better catching and enslaving each other rather than unaliving and eating each other. Lastly, Anita implies here that conquest is the primary way people were enslaved. This is simply not true. Very much like the antebellum South, the children of chattel slaves in the Bible were born chattel slaves. But let's say enslaved people in biblical times were primarily acquired through conquest. Does this mean Anita would consider colonists conquering and enslaving indigenous people was morally justified because the supposed only alternative was to unalive them? I certainly hope not.
Even the Israelites would sell themselves to slavery in order to pay off debts.
Oh, and their wives and children, don't forget that.
This is completely different from what we see in oppressive chattel slavery. For example, in the transatlantic slave trade, people weren't selling themselves. They didn't want to go. They were taken. They were stolen.
Here it is again, where Anita seems to be arguing that just because biblical slavery is not the same as transatlantic slavery, it is more ethical. Which, I can't believe I have to say this, but slavery is fucking slavery. She also claims that because Hebrews chose to sell themselves into slavery, it was more ethical. If you're so desperate that you sell your family or yourself into slavery, is it really a choice? Also, many times, women and children certainly didn't have a choice if their husbands and fathers sold them into slavery. Further, the Bible itself shows that it is not a desirable position to be in. Leviticus 25 verses 39 through 40 commands Hebrews to no longer treat indebted fellow Hebrews as slaves. Then in 2 Kings 4, we see a woman plead with Elisha to help her because she doesn't want her children to be taken into debt slavery.
In order to keep the practice of slave ownership as an ethical one, the Bible sets out these standards, which can be found in the Old and New Testament. For example, Exodus 21, which prohibits slave owners from harsh physical punishments that would result in the slave's death.
Anita is partially correct here, in that Exodus 21 allows masters to beat their slaves as long as they survive for a day or two afterwards. In context, this was to give some protections to slaves. But note, this implies that if the slave dies after a few days pass, the masters will not be punished, because it is assumed that they did not do it on purpose, because who would hurt their property? Once again, this same argument is used repeatedly by pro-slavery advocates in the past and now. I wonder, would Anita argue that antebellum slavery was ethical because they had similar laws? Because in many parts of the South, they certainly did.
And Ephesians 6, where masters are told to treat their slaves with respect.
Let's read Ephesians 6. After slaves are told to submit to their masters in fear and trembling, as if their masters were Jesus, masters are given one meager sentence: stop threatening your slaves. It's important to note that in Greco-Roman culture, slaves were vulnerable to physical and sexual violence, and we have plenty of evidence that early Christians adopted these standards. Think of that when you hear, "Slaves, be obedient to your masters with fear and trembling."
Slave ownership was an extremely common practice of the time.
And, once again, would Anita use the same argument for the transatlantic slave trade? It seems that Anita is fully capable of recognizing that slavery is immoral in one instance, but a special pleading whenever her God says that it's okay.
But if slavery is such an issue for you, stop talking about something that happened thousands of years ago and start doing something to change the world that you live in today.
As we pointed out at the beginning of the video, these aren't mutually exclusive. We can and should point out the moral evils of the past and deal with the moral evils of today. I see pointing out areas where the Bible has endorsed moral evils as doing something about the evils of today. Just as during the transatlantic slave trade, the Bible was used to endorse slavery, it is being used today to endorse Christian nationalism, the genocide in Gaza, and the oppression of women and LGBTQ+ people. When people recognize that the Bible is not the ultimate source of morality sent down by a God, but is actually just a collection of writings authored by ancient humans with antiquated values, we may finally be able to get past some of these prejudices that are driven by superstition that is causing so much of the suffering that we deal with today.